I've got a question for you as we get started. Are you a good person? I participated in an outreach effort on a campus in Southern California. I went around and asked everyone the same question. Are you going to heaven? Almost as if reading from a script, 85% of the people replied with the same four words. I'm a good person. You might feel the same way. You might be able to say, yeah, I'm a good person, and even have some reasons for backing it up. Some of the people that I asked the question responded in a very different way. They said, no. It's not even that they didn't believe in heaven. They just looked at their lives, what they were doing, and decided, I'm not good enough. Whether you answer the question, are you a good person, yes or no, I've got another question for you. How good is good enough? Today we're going to look at an event in the life of Jesus, the one who most deserves to wear the title good. And he's going to have a conversation with the man who's probably the runner-up, the second best person in the entire Bible. In their conversation, what we're going to do is we're going to ask the question, how good is good enough? The story that we're going to focus on is told in three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the man described in it, we don't know his name, but from those stories, we get three descriptions from him. That he is rich, that he is young, and he is powerful. So typically we call him the rich young ruler. We're going to focus on the event as it is told in the Gospel of Mark today. And so we're going to begin in Mark chapter 10, verse 17. Mark chapter 10, verse 17. It says, and as he was setting out on his journey, a man ran up and knelt before him and asked, Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Now this man is off to a really good start because first, he is chasing Jesus. Literally, he's running after him. Second, he kneels before him and calls him good teacher. Obvious compliments to Jesus. And then asks him a question that he feels that only Jesus can answer. What must I do to have eternal life? I've always seen Jesus' response as very odd. Because in verse 18, it says, and Jesus said to him, why do you call me good? No one is good but God alone. Now, I've always found that very odd because I feel like Jesus, when answering the rich young ruler's statement to him, is calling into question his own goodness. But Jesus isn't calling into question his own goodness. What he's doing is he's making a blanket statement so that the man begins to think, am I good? So Jesus doesn't stop there. In verse 19, he begins to list some of the commandments. Now, I want to use this as a challenge. As we go through the list of commandments, count how many of them you can say you have perfectly kept. There are going to be 6 of them. So I want you to give yourself 1 point for every one that you can say you've perfectly kept. Here's what Jesus says. Do not commit murder. 1 point if you've never killed somebody. Then he says, do not commit adultery. Another point if you've never been intimate with someone who is not your spouse. Third, he says, do not steal. Another point if you have never taken anything that was not yours. Next, he says, do not bear false witness. Another point if you can say you have always upheld justice by telling the truth. Fifth, he says, do not defraud. Another point if you've never cheated anyone. Sixth, he says, honor father and mother. Last point, if you've always obeyed your parents. How'd you do? Did you get 1 point? What about 2? What about 3? Can you say that you would get 6 out of 6, that you have perfectly kept all of these commandments? I'm going to guess the answer to that question is no. I certainly don't. I do not get 6 points. But listen to what the man says next. So chapter 10, verse 20 says, "And he said to him, 'Teacher, all these I have kept from my youth.'" 6 out of 6, the perfect score for Jesus' tests. This is why I say that this might be the second best person in the entire Bible. If anyone other than Jesus could have claimed to have been good and good enough to go to heaven, it was this guy. That's why Jesus' next words have to come like a bucket of ice to the face. It leaves you shocked and gasping for air. Jesus then says in verse 21, "You lack one thing." Jesus didn't see the man's appearance. He didn't see the man's position, and he didn't see his success. He could see his heart, and therefore be able to identify the flaw that no one else could see. But translation to that, you're not good enough. If I was the young man speaking with Jesus, the good feeling that I had when I was able to say, "Teacher, I've kept all these things," that good feeling is gone. But I'm not that young man. I'm not even that good. And I'm going to bet you're not either. So I can completely understand the disciples as they're watching this conversation. In verse 26, they ask the question of Jesus, "Then who can be saved?" It would be appropriate for all of us to collectively pick our jaws up off the floor and ask the question, how good is good enough? This might feel like a gotcha moment where Jesus is about to hit him where it hurts. But that's not what this is. In fact, if you read the beginning of verse 21, here's what it says. "And Jesus, looking at him, loved him." Jesus didn't love him because of all of his goodness. He loved him even in his imperfections. If you're married, I want you to think about when you first met your spouse. And if you're not married, then I want you to think about the way that you act around your crush. You put your best foot forward. You try to do everything right. This is the time in the relationship where you open the doors and you say all of the right things. You may even try to actively hide your worst qualities. But there's something about marriage, about sharing a home and a bed with a person year after year after year. Your wife, your spouse, they see you at your worst. And if seeing you in all of your successes and all of your failures can still look at you and say, "I love you," then you can probably best understand the look that Jesus is currently giving this man, to see him in all of his imperfections and still looking at him, love him. Here's what Jesus already knows about this young man. He had great possessions. You see that in verse 22. And Jesus already knows that this man's heart then has been occupied by his wealth. So Jesus is going to give him a challenge. And interestingly enough, when Jesus is listing the commandments at the beginning, he leaves one conspicuously off. He didn't tell him, "You shall not covet." But it's that one that he's now going to address. Because in verse 21, Jesus is going to say, "And Jesus, looking at him, loved him, said to him, 'You lack one thing. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and come, follow me.'" I've wrestled with this passage for a long time because I thought, is that what Jesus requires of all of his disciples, to literally go sell everything that they have and give it away? Is Jesus telling me that I need to do that? And for some, at some times I think, that's not my gift, that's someone else's gift to be that kind of generous. But Jesus isn't giving this challenge to a person for whom it was going to be easy. He was giving him this challenge because he knew that it would be the hardest thing for him to do. Because all of his heart, all of his identity was tied up in his possessions. And Jesus was telling him two things in this statement. One, make me the most important thing in your life. Money to him was the most important thing. And so Jesus is giving him this challenge, telling him, I want you to make God the most important thing to you. The second thing that Jesus was doing was telling him, be my disciple. This is the same invitation that he has given to many. Follow me. It's an invitation to surrender your life and submit to Jesus' rule over you. Heaven isn't filled with good people. Heaven is filled with people who have committed to following Jesus and making him the most important thing in their life. So I ask you, are you going to heaven? Sadly, the man's response in verse 22 is disheartened by the saying, he went away sorrowful, for he had great possessions. Twice in the conversation with the disciples after the young man leaves, Jesus said, it's hard for a rich person to enter heaven. And they're left to wonder, after having watched this whole conversation, then who can be saved? But here's the great thing. Jesus' answer is the gospel in short. Here's what he says in verse 27. In verse 27, he says, Jesus looked at them and said, with man, it is impossible. I hate to be a letdown for the first question with which we began, but no one is good enough. If you've been reasoning to yourself that if you died, you would go to heaven because you're a good person, hear the words of Jesus. With man, it is impossible. Thankfully, Jesus doesn't stop there. The good news comes next. In verse 27, in the second part of it, he says, but not with God, for all things are possible with God. That's because Jesus is about to make it all possible. God is going to make it all possible through Jesus on the cross, offering salvation and dying for all. Jesus offers the same two invitations to us, same two challenges. Are we going to make him the most important thing in our lives? And are we going to commit to following him? It's not about being good. It's about being his.